Welcome to Standard Theory. In the previous segment, we introduced the idea of non-standard or abnormal processes on the Standard Behavior Index. We began with the abnormal processes in horizontal thinking, specifically intimate communication. In this segment, we will continue with non-standard processes on the R scale, including social and silent communication. In a constructive sense, the third characteristic in silent communication concerns self-orientation. This is the process of understanding self-interaction to the point of prioritizing communication to tend towards another person, or otherwise prioritizing communication to tend toward the self. This is also referred to as the free will junction. In the deactivation or lack of activation of the third characteristic, a process referred to as compensatory behavior can be observed. In this process, some sort of observable physical behavior will be utilized by the individual in order to complete the cycle of communication, or in order to account for the lack of activation or lack of proper self-understanding. The process of compensatory behavior is considered by the standard theory of psychology to be the junction that relates all non-standard behavior to intelligent communication. To reach a little bit further, the display of behavior on the Z scale can, in most cases, be related to the deactivation or lack of activation of the free will junction. In theory, since the activation for the communication of this characteristic is not adequate, the individual will compensate in an attempt to complete that cycle of communication in a way that mimics increased activation. This type of behavior can be observed as body language, violence, anger, internal impulse, and other forms of physical response. Any of these are related to the attempt for the body to compensate for the incomplete cycle of communication or activation experienced by the mind. From here we can move to the second characteristic, known constructively as self-interaction. In a deactivation of this characteristic, a process known as intimacy dysfunction can occur. Intimacy dysfunction is a general term that refers to the failure to process or complete any communication cycle that is meant to be experienced in a one-on-one fashion. For that reason, most of the communication that would be expressed during the deactivation of this characteristic can be either unrelated to the specific communication cycle, referential to a social or external construct rather than an intimate or intelligent one, or could be an inverted or distorted version of what a person might truly wish to communicate with the other. The lack of that level of activation, as well as the inhibitory process that would not have been satisfied, would usually prevent an adequate or appropriate amount of information to be communicated. This is especially true when considered the amount of interval ratio information required to complete a dynamically intimate or self-orientable cycle of communication. For these reasons, any attempt at intelligence during the deactivation of the second characteristic can be considered to result in a non-standard or abnormal termination. Next, we can consider the deactivation or lack of activation of the first characteristic in horizontal thinking. In a constructive sense, the first characteristic of communication is related to the self-identity. This is a process that refers to the unique combination of impulsive processes in order to make a new, high-energy idea. When this process is deactivated or is not achieved during a communication cycle, the process known as dissociation will occur. In this process, the environment or another external factor, such as a relationship, circumstance, social construct, or otherwise, will take precedence in processing. The interpretation of the environment will prevail over the unique high-energy association related to the self-identity. In the process of dissociation, the lack of identity will drive the communication. This process of dissociation can lead to various related issues, as disjunction will partially disqualify the communication from silent and intimate communication. When following the termination of the cycle of communication related to the dissociation, there are a few possibilities. This can get confusing as the tendency or preference is related to the individual, the environment, as well as the circumstance related to the dissociation. One path is the changeover to a different communication type. This can be the experience of a subversive communication cycle in shared communication. The changeover can also be to a social cycle of communication by way of the willful separation from individuality in order to continue to the communication in a constructive sense instead of leaving the communication unresolved. Another related option is the tendency to separate from individuality in order to communicate in an indirect sense as an aversive party in supersocial communication. In this scenario, the separation of individuality is also completed willingly. Another scenario is the forceful deactivation of the self-identity, which can lead to a social problem known as shared identity disorder. In that sense, a person is forced or required to communicate unwilling based on the lack of their own identity, which can be discussed later. Another option yet is the changeover to the scale of impulse, which would favor a low-energy version of communication in order to complete constructive communication cycles in a constructive sense. In any of these scenarios, the issue would stem from the lack of a compatible, constructive self-identity. So far we have discussed the non-standard processes in intimate and silent communication. In intimate communication, the sixth characteristic of deactivation refers to a process known as recursion, the fifth related to reversion, deceit and deferral, the fourth related to reversion and anxiety. In silent communication, the deactivation of the third characteristic is related to compensatory behavior, the deactivation of the second related to intimacy dysfunction, and the first related to dissociation or identity loss. Please join me in the next segment where we will present the deactivation of social characteristics.